Hello, everyone. I am Carolyn with the Purple Wave of Northern Kentucky, and today I am talking to Hillary Delaney, the lead researcher for African American History Initiatives with the Boone County Borderlands Archive and History Center. And today we are going to talk about Black history in Boone County in honor of Juneteenth. And if you want to know more about Juneteenth, we'll have a quick 5-minute explanation in our What Does That Mean section on our YouTube channel, and we will link that into the description. I do, before we get started, want to issue a warning and recommend that parents screen this first before they share it with their kids, because some of the information or stories might get a little graphic, and some of this may make people uncomfortable. But when we discuss all of history, it will make us uncomfortable. And I will say that all of the dates, names, and specific incidents that we bring up are backed by source documents. And a lot of this can be found via the Chronicles of Boone County and the Borderlands Archive and History Center. And I will link the landing pages for both of those in the description as well. And without further ado, Hillary, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I hope that this is the first of many conversations that we will have about Boone County history. And I find our history fascinating, especially Black history. But before we get started on that, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started on this research path?
Sure. I am a Boone County native. I grew up here, and then I went to school in Virginia and stayed there for many, many years, and then moved back here about 2009 and was raising my very small children at that point. And then I started a part-time job at the library, having had an education in journalism. So none of that makes any sense, does it? However, when I started working at the Borderlands Archive and History Center, which at the time was a local history department only for the library, we later became an archive, which we are now. We had a question from a community member about the Underground Railroad in Boone County. And I began to research some of the stories that we knew about, which were a handful, but I began to find much, much more information that really was kind of lost to time. And that kind of started the process going.
Well, that's awesome. So I know that there's a lot of work that's gone into the resources that we have available in the county. Like just for example, they have an entire genealogical research database. I can't imagine the amount of work that went into that.
Well, that was pretty much all me. I had one wonderful intern help me for the limited amount of time I had her. And that was kind of the first step after doing the Underground Railroad research, was to go in and start documenting these individuals, because as we began to build out all these little details found all over Boone County history, it sort of kind of sifted itself out, and we started to understand that maybe this person named Thomas might be the same person as this person named Thomas, and kind of make those things link together. But we never could really find a way to lead people down that genealogical path in a respectful sort of way until we found a newer platform. So that what you had there with the database, that was the first step.
Well, I was surprised at how many names were on it. And looking through census records myself, just doing genealogical research, I know how tedious it can be sometimes. Not just necessarily trying to decipher the information, but trying to decipher handwriting. And I saw there was 339 pages of this. I was astounded.
Well, that's just draft one. Now we have a lot more, but we have it in a different platform. So what you see here is those people are also linked into our African Americans of Boone County Borderlands webpage that you can get to through the BCPL webpage and the History Center link. So all these people are in there, and what that database does is it helps to link enslaved people with enslavers, with churches, with burial sites, with events like Underground Railroad escapes or something like that, or marriages, births, deaths, etc. All those things kind of interlock, and there are links on each page that kind of leads you down a path to another bit of information. And so that we're still working on it, but I find new stuff every day. So
it's amazing. It's amazing. Is it common for a slave to have taken their slaveholder's last name?
Well, that's a tricky one, because I made assumptions. Most of us probably, at least in my in my age range, which I'm not going to reveal, but I'm old enough to have a child in college, so that'll tell you. But most folks were under the impression that when someone became free, that they would want to shed those names. And there are a lot of those cases where you see someone who chooses a name either that is associated with something positive for them or freeman, that kind of thing. More often, I find that that's not the case, honestly, because people do identify with names. And even if there's a negative connotation that attaches itself to an enslaver, they still sort of came with that name their entire life. And a lot of people don't disassociate from that. What often happens, though, is because people were traded around and divided up and families were broken up, sometimes those names can't even be found in that enslaver's family. They might have come from elsewhere, from earlier, say an enslaved person held by a family named Ford had a father who was never held by that family, but was enslaved by another family named Smith, and they'll call themselves, John Smith.
Oh.
So you see that a lot, and it takes a whole lot of research to find that path, but sometimes that's the case.
Yeah, I can't imagine knowing the amount of holes that are in Black history research, the amount of time that you've put into that. And I want to show this too. There's a lot in here, like with the Chronicles of Boone County, more than just the genealogical records. You've got church records, court orders, deeds, wills, all sorts of stuff that people can search. And
Sure.
I don't think people know the extent of resources that are available to them if they're looking to do research on their African American ancestors.
Yeah, there's a whole lot. And honestly, it's getting easier. And not just here, but I think across the board, it's starting to get easier. There are a whole lot of grassroots efforts going on to make this information digitally available so that people don't have to travel. And, if the pandemic taught us anything, it taught us that we need to be more accessible as an information site, to people who can't come here. So that's part of that process that's happening here, is to get as much of this information digitized as we can. And also to encourage others to do the same, because there are small organizations to very large organizations who can and are doing this, but there are a lot who haven't started yet because it seems like a lot. So that's part of my mission, is to try to encourage others and give people help, sort of guide them where to start, so that we can make this effort a little bit larger.
Now, with the digitizing of records and doing some of this research, do you welcome volunteers to help with that?
We do. We have some wonderful volunteers and interns that we've had over the years. Student interns from high schools and from colleges come to us often. But we also have community members who are volunteers. And I will say, it is not for the faint of heart. If you are a detail-oriented person, I would encourage you. But if you're not, it can get tedious. It's hard, and there's a lot of sort of sifting through a lot of old records that are in cursive. So sometimes that's hard. Not all of them. We do have things like historic newspapers that we index, things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of information that hasn't even been touched yet. So yeah, there's opportunities for sure.
Yeah, I know whenever I'm doing genealogical research, I'll get questions of, oh, have you found anything new lately? It's like, well, yeah, but nothing interesting.
And I love the idea that you're finding new old things,
I know. It's just, uncovering. Everybody thinks that genealogy or researching, people will end up in this crazy escapade of, some kind of a fancy story or a fun story. But most people are just normal, everyday people.
Although I find other people's families fascinating. I mean, people are just interesting. So even the most humdrum sort of story, just being able to find that path that leads somewhere new is interesting to me. So, but I'm a history nerd.
Well, let's get into that history nerd side and start talking a little bit about some of the early Boone County history, meaning like that we can record with our census records. During the early 1800s, we, according to census records, had about 20% Black population in Boone County.
Yeah, that's right.
In comparison today, where we're looking at around, depending on which site you're looking at, around 5%.
Sure.
That's astounding. And I'm hoping that as we walk through this, we can show why
Sure.
that's
So
the case.
if I can just sort of, okay, so yes, you're right there, except that I think honestly, if we look just a little bit in the near past, it was even lower than 5%. So I think that's coming back up as our county gets more diverse, which is good news. Um,
That's
but
very good.
surprisingly, yes. Well, the people who came here first were brought here by enslavers typically. There were a handful of free people here, some of whom were freed once they were here. In many cases, that was because they were not useful, they were old, infirm. In some cases, there were a couple of people who were free and came here of their own volition, but sort of a meandering path, one of which is our African American Revolutionary War soldier who's buried in Boone County. But he didn't really move into Boone County. He was in Northern Kentucky, but he didn't get here until 1830s sometime. Yep. And so he's kind of the exception to the rule. And my question about him was always, who are his friends? Who is he hanging out with? Because it's difficult to be, he was sort of in limbo socially. He had more rights than enslaved people, but not as many rights as white free people. So that to me is interesting that he stayed around. But I have lots of questions about him. But in terms of that number declining over the years, we also had we saw an increase of non-slaveholding whites as well as enslavers in the area. So we had a lot of enslavers, but of our enslavers, not that many people enslaved more than a handful of people because of the nature of our agriculture here. So you didn't have that sort of deep South 300 enslaved people on one property sort of setup. What that means for enslaved people is it's apples and oranges because they were enslaved and they had to do everything. When you are one of three people working on a property, you never got a break. But on the other hand, the climate here was not quite as brutal. So there weren't as many people who were dying from the conditions during work time here. But there were less people per white person here for sure from the beginning.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about two of the homesteads. The Gaines Tavern House and the Dinsmore Homestead.
Sure.
A little bit more, but am I wrong? Did they not have farms or property in the Deep South as well as up here?
The Dinsmores absolutely did. The Gaineses came from Virginia. I don't know how many enslaved people they had there, but the Dinsmores, who were actually from the Northeast, were conducting business and doing like sugarcane farming, et cetera, in the Deep South. So they definitely had a lot of slaves there. They actually came to this area. My understanding is that because James Dinsmore's uncle, Silas, who was an Indian agent, said, hey, you should settle here. And James was nervous about cholera. And being in the Deep South, that was a huge concern. Now, cholera was here too, along the river, but not quite as rampant. And he was worried about his family. And so he moved here and sort of abandoned his sugar operation and sold a lot of slaves and brought some with him.
Well, you mentioned already, because we talked about Daniel Goff, free blacks as well as slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have some stories of slaves purchasing their own freedom, like the Slate family.
Mm-hmm.
What I think I think it's great that they still have the bill of sale from was it Viney or Vinny?
Lavinia, she helped purchase her husband Simon's freedom and then their children. So she was manumitted earlier with a young child along with one of her young children, but she had other children already. And of course, since her marriage wasn't considered legal in terms of the law, it was well known that she was married to Simon Sleet, who was enslaved when she was free. But they were able to, both of them probably, I imagine he probably hired his free time, which was maybe one day a week, Sundays, out to make money while she did the same. And they scraped it together and bought his freedom and then continued until everyone was free. And they were also having more children at that time. So some of their kids were born free. But they also were able to buy property around that same time. So they were property owners before 1870, I know for sure.
Wow, that's impressive.
It's
Well,
amazing.
one of the questions I get from kids whenever subject comes up of slavery is how would somebody know the difference of a free Black person and an enslaved person, and what keeps the free Black individuals from being enslaved?
Well, there was paperwork for sure. I don't think on site that you necessarily there's no visual cue, except that free people may have been more able to equip themselves better in some cases. And in other cases, they were not as well equipped. It depended on the enslaver and the role of the person who was enslaved by them and what their job was, whether or not they had shoes all the time, whether or not their clothing was nice clothing or sort of work clothes all the time. So there's no visual aha moment that is an enslaved person versus that is a free Black person. But when people were free and living in a slave state, whether or not they were born free, they typically would have some sort of paperwork that indicated that the courts knew that they were here and knew what their status was.
Okay. So that clears that question up, because that's something that it's not, you wouldn't learn that in a history book.
Not so much. I mean, we hear more about that in terms of documentation when formerly enslaved people leave the slave state and go to another state that has kind of oppressive laws where they required them to also give up the papers. But that was going on here too.
So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of slave stories that we have within the county. One of them is notable because of the book Beloved, but Margaret Garner, Peggy, that's what she was also known as. Can you tell her story just in a couple minutes?
Sure. So Margaret Garner was she was enslaved by the Gaines family. She was enslaved first by John Pollard Gaines, who became he was the first governor of Oregon Territory, ultimately. But he went away to war. He became a prisoner of war. He was not here a lot. At some point when he decided to take that position, he sold his farm and the enslaved people that came with it to his brother, Archibald. And Archibald, the younger brother, was not of the same temperament. The impression that we get from history is that John Pollard was a little more polished and a little less likely to fly off the handle. Margaret and her husband, who lived on a neighboring farm to the Gaines farm, left really abruptly. Like something triggered that, I think, and they tried to escape. They got all the way to Cincinnati with her husband's parents and their children. And Peggy was pregnant at the time, and they had 4 children. And they went to the home of a man who was her cousin, who was free and living in Cincinnati. And they were chased the whole way, and they were trapped in there, and there was a fight that ensued. And as the men who were coming to recapture them were breaking into the house, while Margaret's husband was trying to defend the family, Margaret killed one of her children and tried to kill the other ones.
Oh, that's just unreal to me.
It's horrific. Yeah.
It's like there's that book Sophie's Choice, and this is a real life version of that. And I don't know. I can't imagine being in that headspace.
No, and it was a chaotic scene. You can imagine. I mean, there are people outside with guns, inside with guns, windows breaking, screaming, yelling, crying. I mean, there was a lot happening, and all she could think, I think and I can't speak for her, but I think that she was desperate and she did not want to see them returned to where they left from.
Well, she was, considering we have such a strong Underground Railroad history in this region, it's just interesting that this also sparked one of the longest fugitive slave trials in history.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that was a big one. And it really changed hearts and minds, I think, in a lot of places, far flung from here.
Well, she ended up relocated to the Deep South, correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
He was, her family was returned. They were held in jail in Covington briefly without getting too heavily into the legal details. There was a lot going on trying to keep them in Ohio, to keep them from going back to Kentucky. But they were ultimately sent back to their enslavers. And the enslavers were sort of told to keep them around because we're still working things out. And Archibald Gaines sent them to the Deep South. He had family in Arkansas, right on the Mississippi River. And it's actually a place called Gaines Landing, and he sent them off before the courts could come and get them.
Wow. Well, I want to talk about this in contrast with Nancy Magruder at the Dinsmore homestead.
Yeah.
She actually, if I read correctly, she ran away.
She ran away. So in Kentucky and the border states, I know talking about Juneteenth is a holiday that was sort of, it was determined June 19th around the Texas awakening of formerly enslaved people, understanding that they were actually free. Here in Kentucky, the slaves were not free until December 18th of 1865. So that's after the end of the Civil War. Yes. And Nancy left after the war, but before that time. So she left without permission. So essentially she ran away. I don't know that it was that frantic a chase to go retrieve her, but she definitely left without asking.
Well, I read she went to Oxford, and I think I've heard you mention before that this is a popular location for the Black families that relocated outside of Boone County.
Yeah, that's one of the identified migration points where we know that that a lot of former United States colored troops, soldiers relocated there. And I guess some of them were from here and some of them weren't, but they all kind of landed in Oxford. And so she would have known people there for sure.
Well, the thing that gets me is even while she was gone, she still wrote to the Dinsmores for financial support.
Yeah, it's complicated.
And then she came back
and
died there.
Yeah. And we have to keep in mind too, she was older. And I believe, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I know that at the Dinsmore farm, if you go there and visit, you can hear the full story. But I think that she had some struggles in Oxford beyond just supporting herself. I think there was an attorney, she wasn't getting paid, and maybe she hired someone to help her retrieve that income she was due, and that didn't work. And so she had a lot stacked against her, aside from just being elderly and having worked for free her whole life. And she really didn't have anybody to turn to. And she knew that they would, at the very least, house and clothe her, you know.
Well, that's good that she at least had a comfortable place to land after such a
right. Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, I think even though they probably gave her a pretty good deal of freedom, that's still the place where she was not free her whole life, you know?
Yeah, it's tragic. And I think that shines a light on the complexities of slave ownership and slave relationship.
Sure.
And it's never a one size fits all thing in these stories that you hear from these different slave owners. And, you know, slavery is not good in any form. But I do think that sometimes people justify some slave ownership.
Yeah, we get that question or comment in some programs where people often refer to you know, ancestors who were enslavers, and well, that they always had learned you know, from the stories that sort of filtered down in the white families that, you know, that we really thought of these people as family. Well, yes, that might partially be true. Because it is a complicated relationship, you know, and you had women who were serving as nursemaids, who were enslaved, who were nursing white babies, and that is a bond, right? And so even though social structure didn't allow them to have the same rights, there was definitely affection going on there at some point, but it was completely unbalanced. And so when people do say that, I think that's part of the narrative that's been taught. And really, I mean, if you kind of shake that up a little bit and say it's really not quite the same as family, because your family is not enslaved. Your family members are not enslaved by you. They are your family members. And so it doesn't mean that people didn't have complex relationships, but it was never balanced.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's good that you clear up, because we can hear the stories through rose-colored lenses and not realize that slavery is slavery.
Right.
You can't put lipstick on a pig.
And also, I mean, there are many, many examples of formerly enslaved people writing letters to their former enslavers that are really affectionate, but they're also sort of giving what is expected in some cases. I think there is a social structure there that demands that you communicate a certain way with each
Like
other.
Stockholm syndrome.
Right.
So, well, you mentioned it already that 1865 slavery was abolished
Right.
Officially.
Right.
And by 1868, we start
Mhm.
seeing the birth of groups like the KKK, and
Sure.
you start seeing the changeover in politics where the Lincoln supporters, which was the Republican Party of that day, that it wasn't unusual to see some of their leaders run out of town,
Right.
and lynching of black voters starting to
Mhm.
take place for voter suppression and intimidation, and
Mhm.
then ushering in Jim Crow around 1877. And that officially removed the federal troops from the South and started us on this entirely different journey
Sure.
with black and white relationships throughout the country. And what I kind of want to talk about is what happened in Boone County starting in 1866 when we start getting into George Finney and Carter Utes and
Mhm.
Simon Adams. Can we talk about those individuals? You know, we have Amanda Bishop as well.
Yeah.
This really ushered in a different relationship.
Well, I have to say that it's really complicated and hard to squeeze it all in. But the Freedmen's Bureau was established in the South to sort of help this transition, right? Right after actually as early as after the Emancipation Proclamation in other areas. But here in Kentucky, they didn't feel the need to put an office of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a federal organization, here until they were reacting to the problems that Kentucky was having. So we were being managed by a Tennessee office. And then we began to see incidences in our area up here of racial terror, and it was usually targeting returning soldiers who were African American first, and then anyone who had Union sympathies who might be employing those soldiers, or anyone African American who was probably formerly enslaved. And so we're looking at typically a small group of really violent, scary people who are running all over 3 and 4 counties, terrorizing people to get them to leave and threatening the white people, burning their barns and houses, who are offering employment to those people. So what do? Right? I mean, you leave. So that was one wave of people leaving the county. Simon Adams left. He was in Florence. He knew at least one of his attackers. They came and knocked on his door late at night. These guys were wearing masks, but he recognized one of them. And I don't know their relationship, but I do know that his family was living in the same neighborhood as this white man. After Simon was long gone, he went across the river and stayed in Ohio. He first went to Indiana and then Ohio. He never came back. But he did report him, and he reported him to the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau tried to follow up on as many of these things as they could, but they were stretched pretty thin. And I think in a lot of cases that caused people to just leave.
Well, that's unfortunate because when I first moved here, and I came from Hampton, Virginia, which in its own history, they see it as the cradle and the coffin of slavery.
Sure.
And I was always curious when I got here and got familiar with the area, why we didn't have any black communities, especially in a county this size and this close to Cincinnati. So I was very confused as to why we didn't see that. Like there wasn't a black church. I mean, It was just something that is unusual.
Right.
And I don't know if people really understand how unusual that is.
Well, I think part of that is because, because we are so close to Cincinnati first. And in Boone County, there just really weren't that many communities that had enough available jobs, with the exception of railroads, to employ people who were formerly enslaved. And so what we saw was people looking for work, first of all. And in Kenton County, they had the same racial terror happening by the same groups often in Kenton County, in the rural parts of Kenton County. But Covington was a city, right? And offered more industry and more labor jobs and more, forgive me, but unskilled workers, because if you are enslaved and you have one job, you may not have the job, you may not have the skills that the employers are looking for at the time that you need work. So you might just take anything, right? So if you're trained as a blacksmith and there are no blacksmithing jobs, You might just have to go move some crates around, right? And so those jobs were not here. So you had the combination of the terror and what am I going to do to support myself? Right. So that set that up as people just leaving in waves, honestly.
Well, I think the stat that I read was by 1870, 45% of the 1,745 Black individuals that were living in Boone County left at that point.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that's probably right. And I think, and there were some people that didn't, who I was very surprised when they didn't in those racial terror moments, they didn't leave. And that was, that's a clear indication of, boy, I'm going to stay and I'm going to make it work. I just got this freedom and you're not taking it from me. But eventually, I think there were those combinations of it just not being comfortable. And also, there's just not enough here for me to feed my family,
Well, they, according to, like, if you're looking at the research on the county's websites, you kind of see a break in the story from 1865 to roughly 1876.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Was there a quiet period within that time before we get into the Smith Williams and Joe Payne and
I wouldn't call it quiet because, well, okay, so there was a lull once the Freedmen's Bureau had to call troops in to the area, and that was mostly in Warsaw, but some in Boone County as well. There's some indication that there were people in 1870 who did not know that they were free.
Oh, wow.
In Boone County. Yeah, shocking. And there were so many instances where people were reporting things, everything from, I know that this is my child and this enslaver won't give them back to me, because there was some negotiated deal where someone was indentured because the parents didn't yet have work and they were worried about feeding their children. And so they said, okay, I'll agree to let this child stay with you, but now I have a job, so let me have my child back. And they couldn't get their child back. So it's another form of slavery. So there were things happening, but that big surge that happened right after December 18th of 1865, when everybody was truly free, throughout up into that, that beginning of official Reconstruction, it started to calm down, but it was hard fought.
Yeah, because I know that that's when you start getting into things like vigilante justice.
Sure.
And you start seeing the lynchings that took place. And a lot of people that would read these would probably justify it saying, well, they were criminals. But I think people forget that there's no due process involved here.
Right. And yeah, exactly. And I think, unfortunately, the pattern is, and this is not just in Boone County, this is across the South during Reconstruction. And it didn't just happen in the South. I want to make that clear, but it happened more frequently, and it was more widely known of. But there were often accusations of what was called an outrage, which is a sexual assault on either a white woman or a child. Did those things happen? Sure. Did they happen with the frequency that they are reported? No, absolutely not. And I think sometimes it was consensual and then people got caught. And the obvious thing is that was not socially allowed. Yeah. And so in those cases, typically it seemed like that was the best way to save face, was to say this person was trying to assault this woman instead of they liked each other.
Well, we got Smith Williams. He was suspected of killing Fred Wall during an incident near the Anderson Ferry.
Yep.
He was lynched. Yep. Joe Payne accused of assaulting a woman outside of Union. He was taken from the jail and shot.
Yep.
Left on Gunpowder Creek near Pleasant Valley. Parker Mayo accused of attempted assault of the daughter of a railroad worker and attacking a farmer's wife. He was hung outside of town. Mm-hmm. Theodore Daniels confessed to a murder and was hung and shot before sentencing. Charles Smith accused of arson and lynched at Gaines Tavern. Charles Dickerson confessed to the theft and was hung from a maple tree 1 mile east of Burlington. Now, this is at the crossroads of 18 and 237, right?
Yeah. And so Charles Dickerson, or Dixon, depending on what document you're looking at, was a kid. He was a kid.
How
old?
Like
16 or 17 years old.
Oh, man.
What he did is he was accused of stealing from an elderly man on the property where he was living and working. And the elderly man was the father of the property owner. And in the reports, it's like he's an old soldier of 1812 or I don't know, some sort of romanticizing of the man. Well, don't steal from people, right? Yeah, we know that. But he panicked because they knew, and he ran off to Louisville and joined up with the Army. And before he could get out of town, someone caught up with him. And then he escaped again. And he was with some other folks and probably trying to feed himself while he evaded them for a couple weeks, because they found his uniform in the place where he used to live. He had changed his clothes, and he was probably breaking into places and trying to get food. And then they caught up to him and killed him. So,
oh my gosh.
yeah.
And then
He was
you got,
a kid.
it's bad anyway. It's even
Yeah.
worse when it's just baby.
He was a
And
baby.
And then William Scales,
Ugh.
accused of rape and pled not guilty, and he was awaiting trial and taken by a drunken mob at 3 a.m. and shot and hung. And was it the same area as Charles Dickerson that he was hung?
Yeah, and William Scales actually, I believe it was William. The first attempt to lynch him didn't go well. So
there was another attempt to lynch him.
Well, let me just pull it up and make sure I give the right information, because there's so many of these that are similar in the way that they went down in terms of the mob breaking into the jail and illegally taking them out. So William Scales was kind of a sad guy anyway. He was separated from his parents kind of young. He ended up in the workhouse and the children's home when he was very young. He was kind of trying to make it on his own and just doing petty thievery, that kind of thing. But he was arrested, and he was in Burlington, and they took him to what they called the hanging tree, which is where Charles Dickerson was hanged, and Smith Williams. And they began to hang him, and I guess they didn't bind his hands, and he was able to untangle himself. And then he got his neck out of the noose, and the straps broke or something. And then they had to go find another rope and another place to hang him. And then they hanged him again.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that terror went on for a long evening.
Well, the website has like 7 listed on there. Are there more lynchings that we just do not see listed?
Possibly. Now, these are the ones we know about. And we know that there was also the lynching of a man who was not Black, but his last name was Lafayette, but I've heard him referred to as Italian. So anyway, he was sort of othered in the news as being not one of us, not here, not local, not, accepted in the society here. So that sometimes led to less due process. There were also occasions where there was a threatened lynching and it didn't happen. And that happened actually the very first year in 1876. There was one man who was again accused of, attempting assault on the child of the people he worked for. And it was found to be not plausible once they reviewed it, but they had to get him out of town, and then they figured out a way to hold him in jail. And I think that was to protect him. But that was he ended up going to jail in Kenton County. So, but he almost met his death. So yeah, it was going on it was like a big flurry over, a couple of years, and then it would slow down for a little while, and then something would happen again. And I don't know if the same people were always involved, but there was a tone of drunken mob lawlessness in the news coverage of it that made it seem like no one wanted to associate themselves with it, not because of the law, but because it seemed distasteful. You let that sink in?
Oh, yeah.
So socially, we, Boone County, did not want to be seen as a place where the rules weren't being enforced, right? It was embarrassing when the news talked about this stuff. But what I didn't see enough of in those news accounts was, why was it okay for these men to not make it into court? Not why were they able to get away with breaking them out of jail, but it's important to say that this should go through the system before we pass judgment.
Yeah, or execute somebody, especially.
Right.
Well, Jim Crow laws were prevalent throughout the country. How did that those laws impact Boone County?
I know that there were some cases where things were inferred, but then there were some cases where it was, written into either some sort of agreement in the law, under the law, maybe not legislation, but I know one example would be there was a subdivision of property in the Florence area, and it's written into the language of this division of this property that it's not to be sold to anyone who is African American.
Wow.
That was expressly spelled out that this was not to be sold. And I don't remember what year that was. I think I'm saying maybe the 20s or 30s, 1920s or 30s. Maybe a little bit later, but I know that there in my memory, I know that I had family members who told me that they heard an elderly person say that we still have these laws on the books in terms of you better get out of town before dark if you're Black in Florence.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I want to segue into. I know I heard of sundown towns before I moved here, and I'm from Virginia. So when you're in the South, it's not unusual to, see sundown towns. But where I grew up in the South, it was not as prevalent as in the deep South. So
Right.
when I moved here, with us being in Kentucky and close to the Cincinnati and the Ohio River, I was surprised to hear that some people do classify Boone as one of the old sundown towns.
Well, there are certain localities within Boone County. I think Florence got that moniker from rumor. I don't know about the legislation. All I know about is that one subdivision. So I'm going to make that clear. I don't know that there's ever been anything that the county or that the city government put a stamp on. I just know that was the agreement socially, maybe among some people. And all it takes is some people, right? To make people feel unwelcome. There were also people who were, because Florence is so close to Kenton County, right? We're on the edge of Boone County, that it was pretty easy for people to live in Ellesmere or Erlanger or even Covington and work in Boone County if they were working in some capacity that, in some cases like the railroad was coming through and people were coming into Boone County to work on the railroad. Mm-hmm. So I think that sundown town reputation started to begin during that time, because I think people in town were seeing people coming in just for work as some sort of danger, that there were these people that needed to leave when they were done because we don't know who you are and we don't know where you're from, right? And that, of course, was not necessarily the case with the white people working on the railroad, right? Yeah. But I do think that began that. But there were also, in the 20s, there were some large Klan rallies. There was one huge Klan rally that happened at the old Florence Fairgrounds, which is kind of across the street from the St. Paul Church and School. It was at sort of at the corner of 25 and 42. And at that time, in the 1920s, the Klan was also threatening Catholics pretty openly. And so they were making themselves known in the area. So if you were African American and you saw a big cross going up for a Klan rally, I think you'd probably feel pretty unwelcome to be there. Yeah.
Well, I didn't think about the Klan in the area with the high level of Catholics that we have here.
Well, the Catholics at that time in the 20s, they were really struggling too, in terms of, there was a big movement that was anti-Catholic going on. And even though we have a lot of Catholics in this area, they were really having trouble feeling like they were being treated well as well. And there was a wonderful story about the woman who was running, she was a nun, and she was running the St. Paul School, which was very small. And it was in the 20s. I don't remember what year it was, or maybe 30s. I think it was the 20s. But she was in charge. And apparently the Klan was threatening her school and her teachers, and she kind of stood them down. And I love the idea that there's this nun who can give a stern look and scare off the Klansmen, but they were not intimidated. The church was not intimidated enough by that big rally to move. They stayed. Yeah. But, in terms of the sundown town aspect of that, if you're Catholic and white, people don't always know you're Catholic,
That's
right?
true. That's true.
So it's not quite as hard to walk through town in the evening. That's not to say that there weren't people who were defending people as well. There were several people who tried their darndest to stay in Florence. And in one case, I know there was a man who was trying to buy property, and the man who was selling it wouldn't sell it to him. It was in Florence, in rural parts of Florence, but wouldn't sell him the farm because he was Black. And he just got one of his friends to buy it for him, and then he transferred it to him.
Wow.
So he kind of stood in the face of that and said, no, I want this farm. I don't care what you think. I'm going to do it anyway. But you're right. The great numbers sort of lead to the conclusion that people felt unwelcome and left.
Yeah. And I'm looking at the transient population that we have moving into the area now. And I've heard it on several occasions from different African Americans within our community that are not connected with each other. They will say things like they are told not to go into certain areas after dark. Even now, in 2024, they are told this. Is there a basis for that? I mean, as far as
I certainly think there's probably a historical basis for that in terms of people feeling like it's dangerous, because like I said, all it took was, if you look at the history with Simon Adams in 1866, he comes back from fighting in a war for his country and is beaten and chased out of town. So that was in Florence, right? Yeah. And I'm not trying to disparage Florence. I'm just trying to connect the dots and say that all it takes is like the bad apple group that says this is not a safe place for you to be. The bullies are always the loudest ones, right?
Yes.
And so I can sort of understand that, people think the Civil War and enslavement was so long ago, and it really just wasn't.
No.
I can say, and I'm old, but I'm not that old, that my grandmother met formerly enslaved people in her lifetime. Yeah. That's not that far off,
Yeah, my grandmother was born in 38. My dad was born in 40, and
yeah,
they both met enslaved people. They were old.
And that's the thing, is that that's not that far removed. And if that's not that far removed, then it's real easy to understand why somebody who's African American, who just moved to this area, might be warned by other people who are African American who know the history, or even people who aren't, to say, I remember hearing stories about this. Maybe you ought not to go there.
Yeah. How do we offset some of that? How do we grow from that?
Well, I think there are also, I always like to leave it on a happy note, because there are also some really healing moments that have happened over the years where we do have the communities pitching in. The county government is really supportive about pitching in on revisiting this history that seemed to have been ignored or lost or just not noticed enough and recorded in our history. And so that's the starting point. But you also have community members who need to feel welcome enough in all spaces. And that takes advocacy. And that's really what I hope people take away from some of the work that we're doing, is that we can't just record this and say, okay, we did it, we're done. We also have to make people who look like the people we're talking about feel comfortable coming to programs and coming to spaces where we all feel welcome all the time. Because this community is everybody, and we all are paying taxes to thankfully support my salary so that I can hopefully attract more people to the place where I work through some of this, But I do think I want to applaud some of the folks that have helped so much with these programs in the schools, in organizations in our area, in the county government and the city governments, because everybody has to pitch in where this is concerned. And it's not a heavy lift if we all do it. It's really just not that heavy a lift.
Well, and I think that we're starting to see sincere conversation happening. And a lot of times conversation is the first step.
Yeah.
And that's, from the school board perspective, listening to conversations that happen in the DEI committee. It's uplifting to see a diverse group of individuals from within the school system and the community come together to talk about how we can make things a little bit better for all of our students, regardless of what color you are, or what your sexual orientation is, or your gender, that you can actually find a group of people that are passionate about that.
Absolutely. And you know what? And sometimes it's so easy if it's just a matter of, we are making sure that we are documenting people in the right way and honoring people in the right way. And then it just becomes a natural, right? Because if we continue on that path, that's not going to always be playing catch up and always having part of our community feeling ignored and always having, underrepresentation going on, because it just folds in. It's really, if you just keep the pace up, it just becomes a natural, right?
Well, and I think people look at talking about Black history, like this conversation might get criticism because they might think that we are harping on some of the dark side of
Right.
Boone County history, but that's not the case. The big part of healing from our past is actually talking about it and acknowledging it,
Yeah.
and moving on. And I think something that you did recently at the Florence Cemetery is a great signifier of some of the healing that is happening within our community that I think gets missed. But I'm really proud of the work that you did at the Florence Cemetery, and I'll let you talk about it.
Well, I mean, that project is near and dear to my heart because this is a really good example of how much we don't know, right? I grew up in Florence. I used to ride my bike through that cemetery all the time. I had no idea that, X amount of years later, I would be discovering the names, rediscovering. I didn't discover them. They were there the whole time. But rediscovering the identities and the names and the lives of people who either didn't have markers in that section, never did, or those markers were lost, or, destroyed in some way. Unfortunately, that cemetery many, many, many decades ago did not have a fence around it, and there were cows walking through there. So who knows?
Oh my gosh.
But the section that I focused on was majority African American section, and I was able to at least put 120 plus names to some of the burials that we know are there. And it's ongoing. We're still discovering things. But for people who are really excited about learning about veterans buried in cemeteries locally, there are some veterans buried in that cemetery section that do not have markers, and we hope that we can get VA markers for them. There are at least 3 Civil War soldiers in that section who don't have markers, and there are some other soldiers, I suspect. I know Elmer French has a marker. He was World War I, but I think there are even more than what I know. So that's still on the horizon. But, that's just a community thing, right? The Civil War, people love to learn about the Civil War because it was so impactful to us in horrible ways, but also it helped reunite. Learning about it helped to reunite people in some ways too, even though it doesn't always seem that way. I have lots of conversations with like scout groups that go and do cemetery cleanup, and they are definitely focused on honoring each and every veteran. Doesn't matter the loyalty, because that's a complicated conversation, but people who were fighting in wars, who were buried there, are an interest in history, and that's something that pulls a lot of people together, I think.
Well, because when we're in the ground, we all become the same color eventually.
Yep. And that's not the only story that is in that area, but I think that's one of the uniters. People are interested in war stories, honestly.
Well, we talked about Daniel Goff earlier, and I think one of the things I'm really proud of as well is my DAR chapter actually.
Oh my gosh, yes.
With the ground, that marker, but the community master gardeners.
It's beautiful. They do a beautiful job. Yeah, we have a community member who donated his land for that marker. He allowed us to put it there, and the whole county pulled together. They made a little pull off the road so people could take a look without blocking traffic or endangering themselves. The master gardeners have kept that space beautiful. They've had a couple of, at the beginning, they had to figure out what was going to work. Anybody who gardens knows. And some deer came and tried to take over, and they didn't let them. And it looks absolutely beautiful. It's lovely. And Daniel Goff was one of one of 5, maybe 6 brothers who fought in the Revolutionary War, and that is amazing.
That is amazing. And I think that the work that's done just to commemorate some of the stuff in the past is just so important to getting to the point where we can actually celebrate things. And this leads me to the last thing I think we're going to talk about is Juneteenth, and we have a celebration. They call it the second annual celebration, but the first one was canceled. So I look at this one as the first one, and I'm excited about this because this is the first time I can remember since we moved here in 2007.
Yeah.
This is the first time I remember there being any kind of an ethnic related festival.
Yeah, it's great. It's very exciting. Yeah, that's going to be a super fun day. And this particular year, because of the rain and the challenges that posed last year, this year it's at the Nature Center. So there's some covered space as well. So even if the rain comes, everybody will still be there. I think it's going to be a fantastic event. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I am too. And I know that there's, so much work that's gone into it, and and it's a relatively new holiday.
Right.
And I think it gets a lot of crap.
Right. And I want to say too, Florence is stepped up. Florence is doing such an amazing job with trying to preserve history and honor history and be inclusive with history. And this is one of those examples. So I want to give them some credit for that because they're doing a really good job.
Yeah, I'm really proud of it. I'm proud of the strides the community's taken, and and it's nice to be here to see this.
Yeah.
And it really shows me that I really think our community is getting to a place where it's going to find healing.
I hope so. And I see it. I mean, I see it. It's hard you see the micro versions of it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
What we need to see is the healing sort of happening everywhere all at once instead of just a little bit here and a little bit there. So,
well,
but I see it.
Is we're seeing more than just the Black population increase. We're seeing Asian population increasing, and we're seeing the Hispanic population increase, and so many. I mean, we have over, I think it's over 60 to 80. I can never get a firm number of dialects spoken.
Amazing, huh?
Dialects in the schools.
That's so cool.
And when you look at the percentage, like that, we are roughly 90% white.
Right.
That's crazy. And you just think of, well, as we grow in diversity, that number is going to increase.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that adds so much to our community. And I love that my kids have been able to learn from their peers about all different cultures and all different backgrounds. And I remember having this funny conversation with my daughter, who's now out of college, but she said, well, we just don't have any culture. And I said, yes, you do. And I named a whole bunch of her culture, which she recognized, but it wasn't new and sort of interesting to her. And so I thought that was a really good sign that she was interested in other people's backgrounds and culture, that it was so interesting that she sort of envied knowing new things in other people. And I'm sure her, it's all relative, but I thought that was so funny that she voiced it that way.
Yeah, because I think you kind of lose sight of it, especially, when you look at a lot of the larger communities that have ethnic neighborhoods and festivals and everything. And, and we have festivals, but we don't have them defined.
Right.
And so that's why I think this is a really good thing for our community. And I'm excited to see how it grows over the years.
Yeah. And the folks putting this together are working really hard. So good for them.
Yeah, I can't even imagine how much work goes into that. Yeah. I saw a little glimpse of it with the 225th, and I'm like, wow. I mean,
it's just a whole lot of effort. Yeah.
It's a lot. Well, I appreciate you giving me some of your time today. And I hope that the people that have, listened to this have learned a little bit more about our history and feel a little more empowered by it and can see the hope that is coming for our community in terms of some of the changes that we're seeing within our town. So,
yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it because this is a great conversation to have and keep having.
And I'll definitely want to have you on again to talk about, some other stuff that you're working on and, some more detail on some of these things that we just lightly touched on.
I'm happy to do it.
But thank you so much, Hillary.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.